Otherwise, we know a lot more potentially about Dr. Krasnostein than we did. She's a multi-award-winning writer and critic. She's the best-selling author of Trauma Cleaner and The Believer, and wrote the quarterly essay, Not Waving, Drowning, which people might have seen, on vulnerability, mental illness and vulnerability in Australia, which is an incredibly good read. She's been awarded the Victorian Prize for Literature, the Australian Book Industry Award for General Non-Fiction, the Victorian Premier's Prize for Non-Fiction, the Dobby Literary Award, and the Douglas Stewart Prize for Non-Fiction at the New South Wales Premier's Literary Awards. She was the finalist for the Walkley Book Award, the National Biography Award, the Melbourne Prize for Literature, and the Wellcome Book Prize in the United Kingdom. In 2022, she was awarded the Pascal Prize for Arts Criticism. Her work can be found in a variety of publications in Australia, America, and the United Kingdom, including the Monthly, the Saturday Paper, The Guardian, Tablet Magazine, Long Reads, Literary Hub, the Jewish Quarterly, Mention, the Oxford Handbooks Online, as well as various academic journals. She's lectured in postgraduate criminal law and taught creative writing. She was born in America and is based in Australia and has lived and worked in both countries. Interestingly, amongst all of that, her PhD was on pursuing consistency in sentencing and won the Dean's Prize at Monash. So perhaps just by way of background, one of the reasons why we invited her here tonight is, her work's covered the gamut in relation to a number of issues and cases, and in part that includes the Richard Pusey case. And I'd recommend for anyone interested in criminal justice or human condition more broadly to read her article, The Most Hated Man, in the Monthly from June 2021. It is an incredible portrayal of the Pusey case. It's an incredible portrayal of marginalised people and stigma, and she, in part, contrasts very significantly the treatment in the media of Richard Pusey, whose no one would doubt whose actions were terrible at the scene, with the driver of the truck that collided with and killed the 4 police officers, Singh. And so, and her analysis really considers, or her article considers, who we treat with stigma and why, and our approach to outlier cases. And if I can say, one of the points that she makes that I think is incredibly important is that these outlier cases, the Puseys of the world, often dominate the media and lead to a distraction when it comes to systemic issues that we know affect a significant number of people, such as women and First Nations peoples in custody, and that we know where suffering is, we know where most harm is caused, but the obsession with those kind of outlier cases sometimes operates as a distraction in relation to those kinds of issues. Another important article that she wrote in a recent Monthly was on abortion reform, particularly after the overturning of Roe in the United States, and she wrote an article called The Fight to Choose, and that considers really whether what's happened in the United States could happen here in terms of abortion reform, and particularly a return to the devastating and dangerous practices of backyard abortions, which will be a necessary consequence of the decision of the Supreme Court in the United States. And that's just some of her work. So hopefully she'll join us very shortly and we'll be able to ask her questions. Thank you for joining us. And I've done your introduction.
Great.
And I've gone through a bit of a terrible summary of some of your work. So I've tried my best. I'm sure I haven't done it justice. But I might just now turn to some of the questions that I'd have been hoping to ask you. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Terrific. All right. Well, I wanted to start with your work in your essay, The Most Hated Man, when you consider the case of Richard Pusey, and I spoke briefly about him just before. And in part, you contrast his conduct with that of the truck driver, Mahinder Singh.
Yep.
And
right.
yeah, and I guess what I wanted to ask was how the issues of stigma and moral panic inform responses of the criminal justice system to what's regarded as aberrant conduct by individuals.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think for me, it's often the fundamental question. I seem to come back to it in most things that I write. And I'm thinking specifically of the quarterly essay that I did earlier this year on the treatment of mental illness, not just in the legal system, but in our health system. And, previous research into kind of sexual offending. When we consider all of the things that we kind of deal with by not talking about them, and kind of the way that we aim to save face as a society, the things that, we kind of strive to pretend our way out of discomfort, these problems just keep on getting compounded and driven into darkness. Can I just check that people can hear me? All right.
Yeah.
Yep. So with, PC, we saw it quite floridly. The reporting in, places that we wouldn't have necessarily expected a pure law and order politicking line were almost wholesale ignoring his mental illness and his personality disorder, also that of Mahinder Singh as well, untreated, both of them kind of self-medicating, relying on drugs, not in any form of treatment. And we prefer this narrative, which was kind of, again, most florid with Pusey, that he was bad and not mad. So that was kind of operative even, even with Brown, and we have a kind of a new legal landscape about personality disorder. And we are going back to these old narratives that stigmatize mental illness as a moral failure, that kind of want to see this in a very black and white way. And I think it's a very human thing because we push it away, we push it into darkness. It's a safety-seeking behavior, but it makes us all more vulnerable. So Pusey was a very extreme example, and we've seen that in the kind of efforts to amend the offense and the new offenses. But it's all over the place, and you don't have to dig too far into the past, generations not so far removed to us, to see why and where it comes from, and why something that could be perceived as dependency or helplessness or vulnerability was anathema in a white settler country. And we carry that with us still, and we can see it every day in the courts, we see it every day in the papers.
Thanks. And I suppose I'd like to ask you about some of the responses to the Pusey case, and particularly the head of the Police Association, Wayne Gatt, who was reported as saying of Pusey, or saying that he was a worthless individual that lacks any human trait. And further, when his day comes, I hope that he faces the same coldness and the same callousness with which he provided my members when they faced theirs. Do you have any observations about those types of comments or the framing of the criminal justice system into categories of worthy, the worthy and the unworthy?
Yeah, well, you guys would see that, I guess, on a daily basis, and I'm certainly alive to it in my work. I think most recently as well, I'm thinking of Declan Cutler, who, the 16-year-old who was stabbed, I think, by other child offenders, teenagers, in Preston, I think. And we saw the police coming out and saying that they were going to catch everybody responsible and prosecute them to the full extent of the law. And they're talking about children in that statement with the same kind of animus that we see in that statement about Pusey, which is, if we were really honest with ourselves about who everybody responsible when children are committing homicide, that circle is far broader than the children themselves in terms of where responsibility lies. But of course, it's not a narrative that suits the police work, and it's not a narrative that sells papers. And it's one that it continues to kind of poison the well of, community safety as it would ideally be imagined, the fair administration of the law, because it sets up unreasonable expectations, not just about sentencing outcomes, but about the purpose of the justice system itself. This is not lynching. This is law as it's supposed to be conceived under principles that govern the process. But I don't think there's anything new about police trying to advance that narrative. I'm writing a short book now, and it has to do with Ned Kelly. And again, I think that is a very deep-rooted law and order kind of black and white thinking in the society that we have. But it's, of course, breathtaking every time we see it because it is so offensive and it's so dangerous.
There seems to be a brazenness about it, which perhaps I haven't seen in a couple of decades in Victoria, at least, where, you're having people like Gap giving doorstop interviews, on the day of sentencing and making those kinds of remarks. And at least to me, that does feel like a temperature change. Would that be fair, or from your research?
Well, can you say a little bit more about that? I'm not sure I quite understand it.
It's one thing for the police association to lobby and politic, and they've done that for a long time. But now we've got the phenomenon of the doorstop comment where
right.
on the day that a sentence is imposed by an independent judge, like Judge Raitt, the police association feels emboldened enough to make those kinds of comments. Is that a shift?
Oh, well, I think that's what we see, just kind of the normal vicissitudes of politics. If we kind of have all of the economic and all the social conditions that put in more conservative governments, and they are emboldened to do things like that. They are emboldened to kind of misperceive their role and its parameters. And so I think we're always going to see kind of, that the rise of that, and then it's kind of retreat when we get more reasonable governments. But it does very much depend on where we find ourselves in the culture. Also, I'm just outside now. If you'd like me to come in, I'm just going to come into the building. I'm sorry, this is such a movable feast.
Are you happy to keep going while we do that? Or?
I will step into I'll step into the elevator. Okay, yeah.
Wow, this feels like Mission Impossible kind of operation.
Oh, I know. Now I can't even get into the building. So I'm echoing outside the doors that don't close. I'm so sorry, guys.
No worries. Thanks very much. Well, maybe that's a good time, perhaps just to think about a different topic, which is your article in the Monthly on the fight to choose, on threats to accessing safe abortion in Australia following the overturning of Roe v. Wade in the United States.
Yeah.
And again, you're returning that article to issues of stigma, and I just wanted to ask you, how do you see that issue of stigma affecting that issue in Australia, in the Australian political reality?
So, that was kind of a heartbreaking piece to write. Sorry, I'm just kind of hiding in the atrium. So if I'm echoing and you can't hear me, please let me know. But yeah, very confronting. I had worked when I was still at the Department of Justice on the decriminalization of abortion, and removing it from the Crimes Act and putting it into the Health Act. And then I didn't really turn my mind to it for a number of years. And speaking to the people that the practitioners, kind of rural and regional GPs, and surgical providers all around the country, and also, the Christian lobby and their supporters, it really kind of drove home to me just how florid that stigma still is, and how intimately connected it is with religious power as it moves in the Australian landscape, which is very different to how it moves in the American landscape, where it's kind of perceived as a social good. Here, it's much more invisible. We don't have kind of an Australian model for this public evangelical preaching. But I spoke to a number of patients, women, who had abortions, and they were shamed. And what I kept on hearing again and again was that they didn't even know why they were shamed. And so I think that when it comes to stigma, there's so much kind of that's submerged below the cultural norms in this country. And we saw that with the Royal Commission. We saw that not just kind of with the institutional protection of child sexual offenders, but people who had entrusted their children to, men in power who were supposed to be doing something different than what they did. And the deep reluctance to kind of call that out because that they were somehow shamed themselves for not going along with what was quote unquote normal. So the way in which these things are kind of move invisibly in the water was so much more powerful than I had kind of thought. But it makes sense again when we look at things like the private education system, failure to prosecute, or have a meaningful redress scheme, and a lot of other ways that it kind of manifests just as a mark of respect or honor or goodness, morality in this country. We stopped and we actually looked at what the values are or should be and how they could be expressed. Then we would start getting closer to equality and kind of respect more universally applied. But we're so far from that, and I think it really was crystallizing in that kind of what I was hearing about from the practitioners, their fearfulness about their own personal safety, kind of the what they were told in country towns about if they were open clinics, there would be no, basically they would be driven out of town. And again, like kind of the burden that women are meant to carry if they don't want to speak too openly about having a medical procedure for their own personal reasons. So that was really confronting for me.
And some of the reforms in Australia are so recent and vulnerable, brittle perhaps. You make the powerful point in your article about that you'd have cans of tomatoes that in some cases would have existed before there was an access to legal abortion in some Australian states, at least in relation to some categories. And you write that, remember, it was not always thus, and there are no guarantees it will remain this way because rights legislatively given can be legislatively taken away. And I want to ask you, is that an implied argument, in your view, in favour of an entrenched Bill of Rights in Australia, particularly noting the fragility of implied rights that were considered in Roe, and in the Australian context now we have judges doubting or at least one High Court judge doubting the existence of the implied freedom of political communication? Do we need more robust human rights protection?
Yeah, well, I'd be very interested to see what you reckon about that. I mean, it's a yes for me. It's a short answer, but not in... Sorry, I'm going to come in. I'm coming in. This is like the big reveal. This is so messy. I'm so sorry. Okay.
TV show. Sorry.
Come to the mic. No, please, yeah. I'm sure people want to hear what you have to say rather than me.
I'm so sorry.
So I think we were just talking about
the implied
about bills of rights and whether we need stronger legislative safeguards.
So thank you so much. So I think having kind of lived through the unpleasantness of COVID generally, but also kind of those very odd protests that kind of lumped in so many concerns on the steps of Parliament, and the way in which they co-opted a very American language of constitutional rights and freedoms, which doesn't exist here. It's imported. That was dangerous and I think noteworthy. For this, I think we're talking about a different thing. I think that the basic right to equal access to health care cannot depend on who happens to be in power or not. It is incredibly fragile when you look at the ease with which that right can be constricted to the point of meaninglessness. So if you kind of were to have a government that was very conservative or very religious, or when we're all familiar with the way that power moves, simply tweaking the considerations that the doctors have to take into account, or the order in which they have to do it, or the number of practitioners who need to approve it, or the gestation, means that a huge number of women in this country don't have that access. I would kind of, a few years ago, had said that that's a bit of an overreaction. I don't really think it's going to materialize in that way. But again, speaking to the rural and regional GPs and just understanding how those abortion deserts work, what the experience is if you are, the victim of incest or sexual assault, and in a circumstance where you have no income or ability to advocate for yourself, or in a coercive relationship. That is the difference between an early or late stage abortion, and sometimes a late stage abortion and forced birth. So yes, I think it's not an overreaction to say that needs to be legislated into an actual right.
And reading your article, it seems that it's so subjective, women's experiences are so subjective, and that there's that feeling of judgment, and particularly as you're describing those deserts, it's so personality dependent on who perhaps the only doctor is in a 200-kilometre radius.
And, speaking to kind of like Joe Wainer, but also a lot of kind of the original women who were on those organizing teams, and understanding, this cannot depend on who happens to be there or not. Why do we have a system of religious involvement in a situation of socialized healthcare, where A, you can't get the service, but B, the surgeons can't get the training? So abortion is nominally included in the curriculum for obstetrics and gynecology, but the surgical procedures for later stage and more complex cases is a matter of kind of apprenticeship. And they don't have the kind of elders in the field who are able to pass that training down. And I also just think, you don't go around banging on doors to become a brain surgeon or to become, an oncologist. And so maybe we have to look at that training model, because again, it's very precarious.
And what dangers do you see realistically of Australia sliding into a US-style prohibitionist approach realistically?
Well, part of me wants to say we're much more chill here. I know I speak like this, but I've been here since 1994. That we might do one thing, but you can always kind of get it if you need it. But I don't know. I mean, when you look at kind of the influence of the same factors that have, myth that the U.S. was good while it lasted or not. And we're not that immune from them now. Look at our media landscape. Look how, money moves in the country. So I do think, it is something we need to take into account as we kind of globalize into this kind of cultural, political blancmange.
I suppose overlaying that, we've seen, the worrying scenes of the emergence of the far right in Victoria as well, and Nazi salutes in the Grampians, and that things can happen quite quickly, I suppose.
I mean, I think also I'm kind of alive to it now. I'm like watching, not to cite Kanye in my thing, but I went to a Jewish school until I was in grade 12, and not particularly religious, but when I go to synagogue, I went to school under armed guard, and I go to synagogue under armed guard. We were regularly evacuated because bomb threats would come in on Rosh Hashanah, New Year's Day, or if they know, again, we get, this is in the States, Jewish school in the States, but, bomb threats and told not to come into school. So that's like the water that I swim in anyway. So I'm always kind of live to that.
I suppose that can show the danger of rights discourse as well, because we can sometimes assume that rights discourse is inherently progressive, but then you look at the United States and you see the way that perhaps a conservative, now perhaps a hyper-conservative judiciary will protect the right to bear arms, and how that's used, and that arguably a rights-centric culture can have worrying social effects.
Well, this is what I'd love to know what you guys think about, because it is, I interviewed Anita Hill for Melbourne Writers Week, and kind of had this question. I had to be a little careful because she is still has a great deal of faith in the system, is a professor of social and gender policy at Brandeis University. But obviously, I know what she's been through, and it was the question was, how are Americans, because I think this is well and truly passed for everyone outside of the country, supposed to have any faith whatsoever in the Supreme Court's ability to maintain confidence in the administration of justice. And I think part of that is kind of when you have the interpretation of rights up for infinite grabs, and it just is so relative that it's just meaningless. Well, how valuable are they? How valuable are they? But here, I think our court cultures do have more integrity. I have never had. There's cultural and biases and perceptual shorthands, and also we have to look at the kind of landscape of who is on the judiciary. Those are all operative biases that definitely need improvement on all of those things. But when it comes to corruption and politicization, overt politicization, I think we're still far off from that. So, we do need it. We have a better culture, I think, of called constitutional interpretation, higher standards for advocates, I think, in the courtroom. So I think
not too high.
but well, better than there. So we're lucky in a lot of respects. But again, if we're too complacent, look at the quality of the politicians that can easily ride to power and popular opinion. So we're never that far away.
It's not a different topic, and I'm mindful of the time, and we might see if anyone wants to send any questions through the chat. But just before we get there, we're about to head into a state election. At the moment, it appears that certainly the opposition isn't intending to turn it into a law and order election, but we'll see if they can resist that as the day gets closer. But I did, when I introduced you before, note that your PhD, which won the Molly Holman Doctoral Medal for Law at Monash University, concerned pursuing consistency in sentencing.
Yeah.
And I know you've done an incredible range of work since then, but I would like to return to that and ask you about any reflections you have or observations in relation to the largely bipartisan embrace in Victoria of mandatory presumptive sentencing.
Now, anybody who's dumb enough to do a PhD knows that you never stop writing your PhD, and that's really the only thing you ever think about forever after. So I looked at kind of ways in which we could structure the discretion so that we could have sufficient flexibility to tailor sentences to the individual offender, but have enough kind of standards that we would have equitable, procedural ways of doing justice for similarly situated offenders. And I think you only have to open up a paper to see that nearly 20 years of good work by the Sentencing Advisory Council, ways of talking about mandatory sentencing does not do what you want it to do, almost have not touched the sides when there's something like QC or a very visible, sympathetic person is harmed publicly in statistically aberrant ways. And suddenly the animal impulse is activated and there is that moral panic and everything's up for grabs. So whether, those rights might look like, I don't know, I don't think you'd ever get there though, because, it's so easily converted into tying the judge's hands, and it's so easy for the conservative government to just pick the law and order politicking road and ride that into power. So yeah, I'm not hopeful at all. I think there is a way of talking about it that we can short circuit because we know logic doesn't move the world. If that was the case, you would be out of jobs, and so would I. But if we could kind of short circuit to the emotional heart of it and say, well, we all want a safe society. We all want fairness. We do have that constraint in the culture. And this is why that doesn't work. This is why, it's going to actually be a very costly and dangerous exercise. So can we all there is room for that dialogue. But pages are shrinking in print publications, and you have to compete for attention in an echo chamber on social media and online, and I'm really not hopeful. So you guys are doing excellent and necessary work, and
This is the last question from me before perhaps go to the floor, and that's one, I touched upon this before you arrived. One of the consequences that you've written about of this moral panic and outlier cases, the doozies, is that it leads to a failure to address what are clear structural failures in the criminal justice system, particularly the hyper-incarceration of women, First Nations peoples, and that seems to be a real product in part of this tabloid approach to justice.
yes, that's not going anywhere fast. I think we also, this was it's not particularly professionally credible from a legal perspective, but there's a book of essays about kind of the 70th anniversary of Melbourne International Film Festival, and the one that I got assigned was Ghosts of the Civil Dead. I don't know if anyone has seen this, but it's a film that has its own Foucault consultant, and it was kind of 1989, and Nick Cave is in it, and it was about kind of the prison industrial complex in an Australian landscape. And the thing that holds up startlingly is how that's only gotten worse over time when you look at the prisons that have been opened, where they've been located, and who's predominantly imprisoned. And we don't see it in the paper. I mean, yesterday there was a report on the failure of police to meaningfully pursue cases where the missing or dead person is an Aboriginal woman. And I think, again, there is not this public sympathy, public appetite for looking at things like prisons, for looking at things like police practices, because I think if we could kind of talk about it in a less defensive way, we could, again, short circuit the defensiveness and be on the same page. But Australia doesn't work like that yet. So, yeah.
Well, thank you very much. Does anyone have, I do know the time, and if people need to leave, by all means, do so, but does anyone have a question from the floor? Jamie?
Yes, I'd like to address, it was perhaps briefly mentioned, but to look at the question of human rights versus rights and freedoms. I see them, obviously, I see them as very different things, and I think you said, or maybe Mike said, referred to rights and freedoms as being part of the American structure. But it seems to me that the American Bill of Rights is in fact not a human rights document at all, and that is part of why things go so badly. Anyway, human rights versus rights and freedoms.
It's a really interesting binary. I think it's absolutely right. Because of course, when that human rights discourse is co-opted into a freedom discourse, which means the freedom to do whatever I want to do, regardless of its consequences, the freedom to be, I think this is Susan Sontag, unburdened by the suffering of others. And I think one good thing most Commonwealth countries have is kind of a shame about that, or at least a shame about doing that so flagrantly or framing it as a public good. We're very much more the equality side of the equation. Still yet to be implemented here in a meaningful way, and that's invisible to much of the populace. But I think that if we could kind of separate them out and say human rights are something else altogether, this is why it's important that they are positively recognized and protected, and we get rid of freedom, because rights and freedoms, it can mean anything. And I think we saw that as well in the protests with the gap. It can mean my freedom to take my gallows down the street, and all this motley assembly that has really nothing in common. And so I think it's quite a dangerous lack of certainty or kind of clarity about what they mean. Where human rights, there's less room to kind of meld it to whatever you reckon. I don't know. It's a long way of not answering the question.
More work needed, eh?
Yes. Yes.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Do we have any other questions from the floor or online? Oh, yeah.
I think you mentioned before that you were writing something about Ned Kelly.
Yeah.
And I was surprised to think that there was something new that could be said about Ned Kelly.
I'm regretting it now. It's kind of Carl Jung refers to tension of the opposites. And so whenever there's like this very tired reactionary response to Ned Kelly, I find that very interesting. And the continued kind of allegiance that people feel to him. We're not active
I'm
at
sure
all.
they'll come back.
Or is this the ghost of Ned Kelly? Are you with us?
We haven't been moving enough. It's 7 o'clock.
Yeah.
This is kind of, it's a chubby little book, but it's a long essay, and it's ostensibly about Peter Carey, but I'm making it just about true history of the Kelly gang. And that's a book that I found myself completely, utterly surprised to love. I never would have expected to gravitate to a book like that. But again, kind of picking up at the themes of the quarterly essay, it is about how the truest history of the country is the emotional history of the country. And when we're talking about, whether we're talking about poor Irish convict settlers or Irish judges like Barry or policemen, the full spectrum of people in power. That kind of true emotional history is the impossible history because, again, that emotional range is largely forbidden, vulnerability is largely forbidden, but what that book does is it reinvests it into the myth itself. And it's really interesting because at the State Library where the armor is, which looked smaller when I was younger, the kind of narrative on the walls around that exhibition is that this was a crook and the police took him down, and that's on the State Library that has the jewelry letter and has, access to so much more complexity. But again, we don't like complexity. It doesn't sell papers. It doesn't fit comfortably in the national curricula, which need to be revised immediately because there's nothing better to do, according to Peter Dutton.
Yeah.
So, the continuing relevance is a tragedy, but also, I guess, a glory if you're a writer.
Thanks.
Thank you. Any other questions from the floor? I do know at the time. And
Yes,
thank you so
you,
much
guys.
for joining me.
Thank you. Thank you. And I'm so sorry.
All right. We'll just close the meeting now.
Yeah.
All right. So thank you everyone for joining us, and looking forward to the year ahead. And go well. See you at Voltaire dinner on the 18th of November. And it should be a great night. Please join us there. Thank you very much. And thanks especially to our guest, Dr. Sarah Krasnostein.